Good morning, and thank you for joining this week's CoreNet Café. I'm John Matron, Director of Real Estate and Facilities at Geico, and I have the pleasure of chatting with Mr. Michael Hartnett this morning. Michael, good morning. Michael is Senior Director of Research, Northern Virginia at JLL. JLL is one of our platinum sponsors, and Michael, we really appreciate the support and the partnership, and certainly thank you for spending some time with us this morning.
Yes. Good morning. Looking forward to it.
Good morning. Thank you. While we're chatting this morning, we do encourage questions. So those tuning in, please feel free to shoot your questions over using the questions panel in the go-to webinar control panel. So Michael, let's get down to brass tacks here. I know you got a couple of young kids at home. How many cups of coffee are you on so far?
Still in my first, but it's a very large mug. So
good deal.
Yeah.
So trying to keep it under control. I'm on number 2, but I'm just doing half cups. So
okay. Yeah.
Trying to pace myself here.
Yeah, I've definitely upped my caffeine intake the last few months.
Understood.
Whatever it takes. Yeah.
Right. So Michael, another jobless claims came out yesterday with more ugly numbers. I think it was another 2.4 million claims that were submitted. I'm sure your clients are going to be looking for your counsel and expertise more than ever to help develop plans and strategy to navigate through the pandemic we're in. How has the DC region performed during recent downturns from an economic and real estate perspective?
Yeah, no, I think it's a topic on everyone's mind because, history does tend to repeat itself a little bit. And if you think about this region, though, we've always done pretty well, all things considered, in past downturns. So 9/11 being the downturn that, I would argue was really a catalyst for growth in this region due to the creation of new agencies. Homeland Security was founded then, Customs and Border, some of the additional counterterrorism and intelligence bureaus. So especially in Virginia, we saw a lot of growth thanks to 9/11 due to all the stimulus dollars. And then the financial crisis was interesting as well. We didn't see a ton of new agencies form. We did see groups like TARP and more of those treasury groups form, but not any significant sort of real estate impact like 9/11 had. But when we do think about this market and you kind of take a step back now, the federal government here is really the anchor still, and they may not lease as much space as they have in the past. Their workforce employment tends to be a bit of a roller coaster ride versus the private sector, but it's really the anchor. And frankly, thanks to the government's presence here, we tend to weather downturns a lot more effectively than other regions. I talk to my colleagues a lot in Seattle or Boston or really anywhere on the West Coast, and they've seen a tremendous amount of growth thanks to tech, but they've also seen a lot of volatility. And, I would argue that this region here is known for kind of being that safe haven in difficult times, being that less volatile market in difficult times. So this is a very unprecedented time. It's tough to draw, sort of full comparisons to the financial crisis or 9/11. But there are definitely some patterns and trends that are playing out. And then there are some unique qualities as well.
So you mentioned, some growth in some different industries, post 9/11, for example. Are there any other historical trends or patterns that you expect will reemerge out of this downturn?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the main things really, as we look at the stimulus packages in general, again, I think this market here really benefits more than other markets from the stimulus dollars actually being put into place. And it's funny, if you look at employment in the region, we tend to see big upticks in federal employment when there is a downturn because of that growth you see on the federal side and enacting the stimulus. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that again. I think the CARES Act is still in the early stages of implementation, meaning a lot of our early signs point to the GSA, especially on the life science side, really benefiting from the CARES Act and potential future legislation. So we expect employment to follow that on the federal side. So to me, it's a federal employment positive. On the private sector side, it's a little bit tougher right now. You mentioned the jobless claims yesterday, but by and large, I do think that the spread we see in this region of employment from it bottoming out to it peaking to sort of bottoming out again, much less of a spread than other markets have seen in the last 20 years here.
Understood. Yeah, we're fortunate for that. Where are the early green shoots, if any, that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what's interesting about this region is that we can be pretty competitive at times. So Northern Virginia is really bread and butter for defense and intelligence. Suburban Maryland, life sciences, and sometimes those jurisdictions will really compete with one another, such as over HQ2, to really sell their market. And then at other times, those key growth drivers really represent, sort of a great opportunity for them, especially now. So what I'm starting to see is in suburban Maryland, an actual pretty rising number of companies each week get more and more involved on the COVID-19 vaccine response side. Dr. Fauci and NIH really in our backyard here, and really why that market exists in life sciences. And really, as we look ahead now over the next few weeks and months and into 2021, we're expecting suburban Maryland to be really an early winner when it comes to this entire pandemic, just given that talent pool they have there, given the employee or base they have there, and they have a head start. The other one is in Virginia, where we're seeing hardly any slowdown on the government contracting side itself. It's funny, I think you would argue that during a pandemic like this, it could lead to really a delay or just an all-time sort of stop in government contract awards being given out. And about 80% of the DoD is at home. So you would argue that could delay it too. But what we've seen is really no slowdown in awards being given, companies receiving those awards, RFPs going out for future awards. And it's leading to a fairly stable story for the local Virginia economy on the defense contracting side. And the latest numbers I look at show that our fiscal 2020 numbers will not really be too negatively impacted here as we thought they would by COVID, just given that stability story and the fact that awards are still being won.
It's good to hear some of the positive coming out of this stuff, and understood on the I think post 9/11 and post 2008, there was a little bit of a deer in headlights, I think, and wait and see from a lot of things. So if things start to moving in the right direction from a real estate market perspective in that suburban Maryland area, that'd be great for a lot of folks, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think in DC, one of the interesting sort of anecdotes we've seen now is around lobbying and government affairs. And the CARES Act was the second most lobbied piece of legislation of all time. So you had a tremendous amount of groups really hire lobbyists for the first time, and really only second in terms of lobbying spending ever to the financial crisis itself in 2008. And what we saw in 2008 when lobbying ticked up so much was also a bit of an increase in leasing activity. So it's something we're keeping a close eye on in terms of what that impact is on the commercial real estate market. But it was a tremendous quarter on the lobbying side, the largest quarter of all time. And again, a lot of these companies really getting into that space and hiring someone for the first time.
What do you think, Michael, are the themes and trends that are front of mind for landlords and tenants regarding reentry and sort of future strategy?
Yeah, it's a wide spectrum right now. I think a lot of the larger tech companies have been, I think, the most vocal. I saw that Facebook announced um, just that in 10 years from now, they're expecting about half of their workforce to be remote, and that's a 45,000 person workforce today. So on the one end of the spectrum, you're seeing from the tenant side, many of these tech companies, Twitter doing the same thing, really come out and force around what is, you know, frankly, a drastic solution here in terms of shifting that amount of your workforce to work from home. Now, it doesn't, imply you can just work from home if you want to. You have to be a good performer, they said. If you live elsewhere, cost of living impacts will hit your salary. But I am seeing on the tech side out of Silicon Valley pretty drastic measures there when it comes to either keeping their employees home out to 2021 and having that meeting count stay under 50, or just thinking really long term again with the work from home policies in general moving forward. I think in general though, on the tenant side, just kind of putting Silicon Valley aside right now, um, a lot of tenants are just in a trial and error approach and a wait and see approach a bit. And many of the ones I talk to on the GovCon side, for example, locally, um, again, they're very competitive and they think that there's still a lot of opportunity out there in the next few years to keep winning contracts. And again, I'm not expecting that to slow down either. So it really comes down to how best can you work. And sometimes I'm seeing some anecdotes around for classified space. Do you work in that classified space in the morning and then work at home in the afternoon? So there is no one answer right now, but I think in general, on the tenant side, as we look ahead, there's going to be more of an appetite for this idea of flexibility. And one of the big things we've seen in this region, in the suburbs especially, is live, work, play. It's a buzzword, but it has played out. You've seen a lot of transit-oriented projects around this region adopt that live, work, play model successfully. And I would argue that that could be a potential success story and a model for um, offering that kind of flexible work environment where you have the ability to go into work, but you don't live too far away necessarily, right? So the idea of flexing in and out there. But it's a wide mix right now. On the landlord side, um, we've seen across the board, a real sort of watchful eye on what tenants are thinking and rent collections, for example, on the office side, especially. We saw that north of 90% in April. We're tracking that closely in May right now on the rent collection side. But I think in general with landlords, they're going through the same mentality and process and trying to understand what is in the tenant's mindset and how do we accommodate those tenants if we need to. So it's a very early stage process right now.
And I think that as more companies try to figure out work from home, there's a tech investment that's got to happen with that too. So maybe that's a little bit of the cycle to you know contribute to some stimulus in other industries.
Yeah, and there's definitely many schools of thought around just the density itself. There's arguments that um, tenant, reentry could lead to the ability to need more space instead of less if you're changing your density patterns and really widening that gap between workers or meeting rooms. Um, I don't think that will be the case for most industries. I think you could see that for some, but I think in general, a lot of companies are really thinking about right now what percent of their workforce can truly effectively work from home, either full time or part time, and then that would lead to their real estate decision then. Um, but leases have to expire, and some may be short term renewals before they can make those larger decisions long term.
Maybe you're starting to hear from landlord clients and tenant clients about some of their strategies and what you're seeing from that densification perspective, building systems, and how they're managing that. Are there any trends you're hearing from your customers, your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So on the tenant side, the big push is really on wellness, obviously, and um, visitors too. And I think what you'll see is a real drawback in visitors and in-person client face-to-face meetings, at least at first, because it sounds like a lot of the policies and procedures that building owners want to enact are around that visitor log and screening visitors and whether that's temperature screenings or otherwise. So there's just going to be a much deeper focus on each employee and each visitor in the space and whether that's a health screening or just keeping you further apart, I think you're really going to see a lot of these policies just, again, kind of being a trial and error approach to see what sticks. A lot of the kind of early signs we saw in Asia when it comes to these different plans, some worked and some didn't, such as the temperature checks in the lobby before you go into the space. Um, the elevator policies as well and flexing that and adjusting that. So many tenants are really thinking about that right now. The question is, what is the capital involved? What is that sort of happy medium we can hit so that we're not sort of overspending and adopting something effective? It's a little TBD though.
Understood. So you mentioned some of the early signs in Asia where some reentry is starting in some forms. From an economic or market perspective, are there any models or parallels you can draw or look at from international markets, or are they just things too disparate to make any comparisons?
Well, I think it's too disparate. I think in the next few quarters we'll be able to have more data to determine that. I think it's a little too disparate right now. Some countries in Europe are ahead of others with going back as well, or the advanced economies are, and I would argue it's a little too soon. But the big thing to watch for really is, which markets have the most diversification. If you're in an industry, oil and gas, for example, if you're really exposed by tourism, that's tough. And I look at a lot of stats that shows our region ranking really well when it comes to future performance and diversification because we don't have exposure to those major vulnerable industries right now, such as hospitality, like a Las Vegas would or an LA would.
So get out your crystal ball, Michael. Relative to some of the past downturns we've seen, how do you expect the curve or the path to recovery to full strength or as close to it as we'll get? How do you expect that to compare to some of the past events we've had?
Yeah. I think in the 9/11 crisis and dot-com bust, we frankly saw in this region a very speedy recovery because of all the growth that it brought. Financial crisis is when we did see a longer downturn of about 8 to 9 quarters total, depending on which market. I think this one, there's a lot of talk at first that it could have been a V-shaped. I think now it's more of a U-shaped recovery. So as you watch those employment numbers come out, especially yesterday, and the lingering employment or underemployment, if you will, it's a tough call. But I think it's more of a U-shaped recovery, and this will be a longer one than we saw with the financial crisis and 9/11. And frankly, one of those reasons is because just the way this has affected our ability to work right now and just the public health perspective of it that we didn't have in those downturns. And you really can't compare it to anything else. And in the financial crisis, when they passed a lot of legislation, it was implemented pretty quickly. Here you saw challenges with the Small Business Administration loan process. You even see challenges with just the federal government being able to implement this, again, just due to the constraints right now of working from home. So I think I can't give a quarter total, but I think this is going to be a bit longer than initially expected with the V-shaped recovery.
Understood. And obviously, health implications, is a big factor here. But What are some of the other risks or barriers that you see, before we start to get to that recovery?
Yeah, yeah. I think health is by far the biggest one. I think the second barrier is really just this discussion around your physical space and where you set up to live in this new world, and how much capital do you have to spend to get to where you feel is a safe and you know kind of workforce that or workspace, I should say, that people want to be in again. So the health side is really just one of it. I think the bigger topic of discussion is around the prop tech side, and how much will it cost to enact some of these technologies, and what changes do you need to make to your physical space, short term and long term, to accommodate this new world. Um, I think it's going to be tough. I think a lot of companies out there, um, you saw especially with co-working, we're really pushing for densification, and that's being drawn back pretty heavily right now. And many of these groups were not really in leases that allowed for that kind of flexibility, if you will, to just suddenly expand the distance between desks, or um, the meeting room spaces as well. So it's gonna be a tough challenge. I think just as tough as any other factors with this crisis.
Couldn't agree with you more, Michael, on that front. It's just so hard to predict when's the right time to implement that long-term strategy, and if there is a right time for it, until you have more clarity around the long-term impacts, and how long the virus will be around.
Yeah, I think some early signs I've seen of reentry when it's in phases. Um, there's perks offered, such as making sure your employees have boxed lunches, or coffee, or amenities that are closed around you, right? A lot of these groups that are going back sooner than later are finding that it's tough to even work in that environment, because you don't have a lot of the typical amenities you were used to pre-COVID. And so I think as an employer, there's a real watchful eye now on just employee well-being, and making sure that um, your employees feel like they're not being forced to go back, or are not really getting the safety they're looking for, if you will. So it's a challenge for employers, and it's a challenge for landlords too, I would argue.
As you talk to clients, are there one or two pieces of advice that you're giving to them as they start to prepare reentry plans, or start to prepare budgets for future capital projects?
Yeah, I think the big thing is really just around your workforce itself right now, and the mental well-being of your workforce. And there's never been, a bigger attention or emphasis being put on your own employees' well-being at the moment. So I think a lot of tenants are really starting there and determining who's essential and who's not essential, who's comfortable working from home, who can ride this out, who needs to be in the office. And a lot of them are really starting there, and basically seeing as this goes, did that work, and where do we need to adjust and tweak as needed. But I think that's the big discussion right now, is really assessing your own workforce and um, deciding those factors. It's tough. I think you have to determine who's ready to go back and who's maybe not ready, and a lot of it comes down to someone's personal choice sometimes as well.
Yeah, well, wellness is top of mind, I think, in the office, and for those that are in the work from home condition as well.
Yeah, I think even beyond COVID, this could be a real inflection point with really how we build out space, obviously, and think about space from the wellness perspective. I think you'll see a lot of new innovative ideas emerge out of this for the workspace of the future, and having that wellness perspective. We saw, really starting in the 90s with the Oklahoma City bombing, a real push on the physical security side, especially with government buildings. And I think you'll see a similar theme play out now, with not necessarily physical security, but that wellness emphasis. And perhaps the government may lead the way there. We'll see.
speaking of wellness, believe it or not, it's a holiday weekend coming up. What do you do, Michael, to stay active and to stay sane through all this?
I try to get out as much as I can. I do a morning run. I was looking out the window. It's raining now, so I didn't get to make it out this morning. I live near a lake. I'm in Reston, Virginia, so I'm a big fan of just being out on the water, paddleboarding, anything we can do there. On bike rides too. So trying to balance the social distancing with just trying to stay active.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. That's great. Well, Michael, your wealth of knowledge. Appreciate you spending the time with us this morning. It was great to chat with you, and I know our listeners learned a lot. In closing thoughts, anything else you wanted to touch on before we go?
No, I think the real trend, I would argue, as we look ahead from an economic perspective is yes, these are challenging times. It's unprecedented. I think you can gain a lot from history, though, and the sectors we have here with government contracting, life science, and the Fed in general. And when you look back on this crisis, I think you'll see that we weathered this much better than the more volatile markets that solely rely on tech, oil and gas, hospitality. So I feel more optimistic than maybe some, but I think the composition of this region is going to help us more than hurt us.
Well, I said it at the start, but I'm sure your clients will be pursuing your counsel and your knowledge more than ever to help figure out some of that modeling and those past trends to pick up on. So, Michael, thanks again for joining us this morning. Appreciate it again. Appreciate your time and JLL's sponsorship and support to the chapter. And we hope to talk to you soon, and hopefully it's in person next time.
Yes, thank you. Enjoyed it. Have a good weekend.
Thanks again. You too.